Hey everybody, welcome to another episode here on Bully Whispers, and we are here today to take a look at how snitches are handled in The Sopranos and Breaking Bad. Within the world of organized crime, snitching is obviously looked down upon,
And their motto is, and we know this from popular culture, television, and probably books, snitches get murdered.
which we certainly see plenty of in both shows. When coming from the underworld, it's not only accepted, it's expected, and other than Adriana, the audience is generally delighted to see it happen. But when it does, it's often accompanied by some criticism directed towards law enforcement, usually something along the lines of the death is their fault, they don't care about them, and or they should have done more to prevent it. So in this episode, we will look into whether or not the deaths were their fault, whether or not they cared, and what more they could have done, by first looking at what their goals were and whether or not their methods and motives lined up, as best shown through Agent Harris, Phil Leotardo, and interestingly enough, Greg the Grim Reaper Scarpa, before moving on to the differences in how the snitches were treated individually and why that may be the case, including the circumstances behind them becoming a snitch, as well as the personality of their handler. Then we will move on to whether or not they cared by looking at each agent's mentality, especially Hank Schrader's, where we run into a telling parallel with Netflix's new series Get Gotti involving Willie Boy Johnson, and end with what they could have or should have done differently. When it comes to the first part, what their goal is, it's simple: to get as much information on their target as they can, being as objective as possible, and for a while it seemed like Agent Harris would be a great example of doing just that. He knows what kind of person Tony is, but after he switched to anti-terror and Tony was no longer his target, Tony became only a source of information, and no lingering grudge or desire to get him remained. His focus was anti-terror. He gave Tony a heads up about the possible hit from New York, which some may consider shady, but like he said, if the FBI had just a little more info, they would have told Tony themselves. So all he really did was tell Tony a little early to keep the information flowing, and at the very least keep Tony happy, because remember, Tony is a voluntary informant. However, moving forward, things get a bit murkier, because while his objective may still be correct, his methods and motivations start to come into question when the New York-New Jersey war kicks off and he gives up Phil Leotardo's location. Now, the idea of agents giving up the location of gangsters during a mob war isn't new, as Lynn DeVecchio was alleged to have done just that in real life by giving information to Greg Scarpa during the Colombo Wars. Interestingly enough, Agent Harris mentions jokingly that this is the type of scenario Tony is preparing for.
Looks like they're expecting World War III.
More likely the Colombo Wars.
And then he ends up giving Tony information when it actually happens. Now, it is possible for him to justify his decision to give up Phil Leotardo from a practical standpoint, though not an ethical one, by saying, I need information, Tony gives it to me, Phil does not. If Phil wins, then Tony will die and I will not get any more information, so Tony has to win, and that will only happen if Phil dies. Of course, Butch and the New York guys had already given up on Phil, but Harris didn't know that. Either way, had he used this justification, it would clearly be an ex post facto one, as his true motivations are revealed when he hears the news.
Yo, beat. Phil Leotardo got popped.
Damn, we're gonna win this thing.
He had gotten too close, like Skip Lipari. It's important to note here that with Skip being the first handler we really get to see up close, he sets a tone that makes all of the other handlers look cold in comparison until Agent Harris later in the series. That being said, all of the snitches are treated differently. With Adriana and Big Pussy, we see them getting leaned on pretty hard, although Big Pussy is allowed some pushback, but this doesn't seem to be the case with Ray Curto. With Ray, they didn't appear to lean on him much at all, and he is even hounding them about getting money, as opposed to Skip and Big Pussy, who seem to have an opposite arrangement. Although, to be fair, we don't really see much of Ray, so that may be the case for him as well. There's also the possibility that he was a voluntary informant, like Whitey Bulger and Greg Scarpa, doing it for money and more freedom to operate, so they can't really lean on him in the same way because they don't have a case on him like they do with Adriana or Big Pussy. Of course, there is more to consider than just the circumstances and personalities of the snitches. There's also the demeanor of the agents handling them. While some agents, like Skip Lipari and Dwight Harris, switch into becoming too close, others, like Frank Cubitoso, Deborah Cicerone, and Hank Schrader, stay fairly consistent. In the cases of Cubitoso and Cicerone, they remain calm and professional throughout, and in the case of Hank Schrader, he is consistently aggressive and detached. Now, it could be argued that Tortuga's death shows that he was not completely detached from his snitches, but I think it was the traumatic nature of the whole experience more than just the fact that Tortuga died. After all, he wasn't fazed by Crazy Eight's death, and he shows his justifications as to why with Jesse Pinkman, but we will get to that in a bit. Another thing we can see through Hank's interaction with Tortuga is how differently he treated snitches than the other agents. Tortuga isn't just asking for reimbursement or something small like that. He is making crazy requests from a Sky Mall catalog, like a Derek Jeter signed baseball, and $2,000 bill rugs, though he settles for $5, and none of the other agents are even remotely fazed. Hank, of course, immediately and instinctively takes on the role of bad cop.
How about you stop jerking us off here? Where's the meat? When's it going down?
But is quickly shut down. This begs the question, why was Tortuga treated so well? And it's important to note here that we don't really know his backstory. It is possible that he was a voluntary informant, but even if he wasn't, he could just easily disappear back to Mexico for good, and there's not much they could do about it. The only thing they really could do was let it be known that he was a snitch so the cartel would kill him, but for every snitch exposed, it makes it harder to get new ones.
When we have an informant, part of our pitch is we will not disclose your identity.
Which is where we begin to run into Willie Boy Johnson, Hank Schrader, and Jesse Pinkman. Now, it could be argued that Jesse wasn't a snitch because he was never registered as one, his operation was never approved, and none of it was on the books, so it was really more like he hooked up with a rogue agent. However, that would just be semantics. He teamed up with and gave information to a DEA agent in an effort to arrest Walt. That's a snitch. If they had done all that in an effort to kill Walt instead of arrest him, then that might be a valid argument, but that's not the case. Either way, the significant factor when it comes to this operation in terms of this discussion is the justification that Hank displays.
Oh, you mean the junkie murderer that's dribbling all over my guest bathroom floor? Well, then he's right. Pinkman gets killed, and we get it all on tape.
He views Jesse as worthless, almost as if his fate is already written in stone, and has no problem facilitating that ending as long as he gets what he wants. In real life, during one of John Gotti's trials, prosecutor Diane Giacalone outed one of Gotti's co-defendants, Willie Boy Johnson, as being a snitch, essentially sealing his fate. Now, obviously she was a prosecutor, not law enforcement, but her justification...
But we did what was necessary. We knew that his life expectancy was not good.
A man was killed, mob style, outside his home in Brooklyn this morning.
I'm sorry that he was killed. I feel very sorry for his family. But it was an inevitable end to a life that led in only one direction.
Shows a very similar mentality to that of Hank Schrader. Of course, it is important to note that being a snitch is inherently dangerous, and voluntary or not, at the end of the day they didn't have to do it, but there is a difference between understanding that their snitch may get killed and not being particularly shaken up about it, and being willing to actively facilitate their demise. This difference in mentality is what separates the agents who care, at least as much as can be expected, from those who don't, and Hank Schrader clearly does not. Going back to The Sopranos and Agent Harris, he doesn't care either. Now, it's a little less clear-cut with him because Phil Leotardo wasn't a snitch, let alone his snitch, but nevertheless, he was willing to facilitate someone's death for his own personal reasons. Moving on to the agents that did care, Skip, Frank, and Deborah, what could they have done to better ensure their snitch's safety? Should they have followed them around all day? Well, this would be easier to pull off with Big Pussy without drawing suspicion, because gangsters getting tailed is kind of par for the course, but in either instance, this tactic would eventually make both Big Pussy and Aid less effective as snitches because people would know they were being watched. In the case of Adriana specifically, there is a common criticism that as soon as she said Chris would join, they should have sent someone over to her, but Aid rejected the idea of even pushing him too hard to come in on his own. She said that he would back out if he felt too pressured, and sending an agent over would be more than just rushing him. Ultimately, I think it's Adriana's likability that draws these criticisms, though, as I doubt there would be the same reaction if someone like Richie or Ralph were in the same situation. Well, thanks for watching this episode here on Bully Whispers. As always, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you at the next score.